Hey everybody, how you doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on Buddhist philosophy, specifically Linji, his life and teachings. Linji is one of the central, if not the central grandmaster of Zen Buddhism. I avoided Linji for a while, but then I had to, in teaching Buddhist philosophy, hit the books again. And I came to Linji's sermons, and I found that while in the past I had really enjoyed Joshu and the Blue Cliff Record koans and koan cases, the most famous two of history are What is the Sound of One Hand Clapping, and If a Tree Falls in the Woods and No One's Around Doesn't Make a Sound, that kind of thing. We've had several of the Zen masters up until now. Please watch my other talks. There's a lot of Buddhist philosophy and Taoist philosophy packed into early Chinese Chan, what the Japanese call Zen. However, the reason that I chose to do Linji first rather than Joshu, and I love Joshu, Xiaoshou in Chinese, I often call him Joshu in Japanese. Linji is actually Rinzai in the Japanese, one of the central schools of Zen Buddhism still today, one of the central religious groups of Japan. But Linji's sermons are really one of the best places to understand what koans are and what Zen is, and I'll get into it as my notes go through it, and I'm going to try to not do as many tangents as I often do because I want to cover so much of the material and there is so much detail to cover in Linji. But let me just say, and I will say this rather than go on many a tangent, if you study Linji's sermons, and he says once or twice, "This much I say clearly," he is telling you a lot of what his house is then going to understand behind the new kind of text that Linji's house, the house of Linji, what became Rinzai Zen in Japan, is making a new kind of religious sacred text called the Koan collection, which is cases like What is the Sound of One Hand Clapping and interactions between masters and students that are rather puzzling. I think you can clearly see that these are Taoist kinds of trickster sorts of behavior and tales then put in a new Buddhist tradition, and then you can understand quite a lot about that reading Chinese philosophy, Taoism, Buddhist philosophy from India, and then understanding Zen. But it's Linji's sermons here, and we're going to first go over his life and some of his core teachings, and then we will talk through some of the paragraphs of his sermons. And that is some of the best stuff I have to say to understand before we then start hitting Joshu and the koan collections. And we will finish the lectures for this semester for the Buddhist philosophy class. Sorry to have been taking my sweet time. Hurt my foot. Hard to lecture with a hurt foot and other things. And I've been putting together the room a little different and got the camera a little geared up here. But we're going to start here with a series of talks on Linji. I'm going to take it slow and try not to get into any tangents because I can connect this stuff in and out of Taoism and in and out of a lot of the koans. So we're going to go through the koans, Joshu, and then the Blue Cliff Record, and then the Gateless Gate. And we're going to go through those slowly. And I hope for the rest of this week to get out a couple of talks on all of that in a row. So if you want, I have a link to the Gateless Gate. Read through the koans of the Gateless Gate, and then use this talk or two or three on Linji's lectures and life to understand this and other koans and Zen Buddhism as a whole. So Linji, the Tang Dynasty Zen master, who lived around 810 to 866, so only lived about 56 years, known in Japan as Rinzai, is the central Grand Master of Zen, as his teachings and followers created the texts and practices that have been core to Zen tradition for the last 1,000 years. I remember the song is around the year 1000, 1100, 1200, so it is a little after 1000. So again, 1,000 years ago is when this reached its heyday, although Linji himself lived around 1200 years ago, and his school became hip 1,000 years ago. The house of Linji made the sound of one hand clapping and the tree falling in the forest when no one's around the paradoxical objects of contemplation many have heard of today. Huairong told Mazu, if you look at the last talk on Mazu, if you try to sit like the Buddha, you kill the Buddha. And it sounds like he means it's a bad thing. You're killing the Buddha, kid. Linji infamously takes that, flips it on its head, and says, when you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha. And he is the one who says that, and he says it in his sermons, and he explains, and in fact, it makes a decent amount of sense. I would say you can put it in the context of either Christianity or science or truth, and it makes a lot of sense, even if you are not a Buddhist. But he is saying when you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha, as if it's the thing to do. Now, Mazu's teacher, when Mazu, the last great Zen master there were many, but Mazu, it goes Bodhidharma, and then Huineng is the next very major important one. Then Mazu, who's the first guy to use Chan, aka Zen, and he starts freaking people out on purpose and being kind of unconventional, glaring at people and pacing around like a tiger and calling people's names out and jerking them around. So Linji, when he says, kill the Buddha, this is now, understand, after the last talk, Mazu's school has now turned into several houses of Chan, and the one that is going to win, quote, quote, history, the one that's going to be in the Song royal court is Linji's house, what becomes Rinzai in Japan. So Linji is the guy who gets a following in a house under, okay, kill the Buddha then. If Mazu, I'm just taking what Mazu says downfield a bit. And Linji said in a sermon to his monks, followers of the way, don't take the Buddha to be some sort of ultimate goal. In my view, he's more like the hole in a toilet. Bodhisattvas and arhats, those are godlike beings and also independent guru sages who are gaining powers on their own as independent geniuses. So gods and gurus are all so many collars and chains, things for tying people up. The way I see it, we should cut off the heads of the Buddhas. Those who have completed all stages of bodhisattva practice, working their way up the chain to Buddhahood considerably, are no better than hired field hands. There's a little bit of the lieza here. Those who have obtained high stages of enlightenment are prisoners, shackled and bound. Sages and arhats are just so much crap in the toilet. Enlightenment and freedom are hitching posts for donkeys. Mahayana Buddhists believe in non-duality and identifying with all conscious beings. Huineng, the third to last, the Chan master after Bodhidharma, tore up sacred texts and said that the Buddha is and isn't. Huairong said trying to be the Buddha is killing the Buddha. Mazu pulled noses, kicked people, and said mind is Buddha and no mind no Buddha, acting as if everything as well as its opposite is true. Out of this line comes Linji, who said we need to have greater faith in ourselves, so let's kill the Buddha, while basely insulting everything that is holy. Why would a revered Zen master who takes Mahayana vows of compassion for all living beings, who take vows to not kill and not cause bad karma in many, many ways that get complicated and quite doctrinal, why would he tell us to kill and the Buddha of all people, if the Buddha is a person or all people? So Chan had some support in the Tang dynasty from 618 to 907, the time when the revered masters Huineng, Mazu, Linji, and Joshu, we'll get to next, taught. But the imperial court supported other Buddhist sects such as Tiantai and Huayan far more. Some intellectuals and artists turned from these and northern schools of Chan to the southern protest of Huineng, talked about 2 talks ago, who tore up sutras and taught the lowliest born could be the greatest master. After the imperial support for Tiantai and Huayan, and also Taoism is flourishing in the Tang, very much in gaining imperial support. As they ended, and the support of all this ended with the fall of the Tang, the legend of the incomprehensible and unconquerable Chan master took hold in the 5 dynasties period between the Tang and the Song, around 907 to 960. So you can see, and I can provide my sources, I use decent sources, and new scholarship is bringing to light that you have this Chan master who seems to be a kind of very much Taoist Chinese trickster sage, unlike like some things you find in India, and they could have found some pieces in Buddhist early texts, of course, but very Taoist, and they quote the Taoists also throughout, and they seem to know their Taoist texts during a period when Taoism has great favor and is a philosophy they debate with specifically, and people interrelate with Buddhism, and many schools of Buddhism. So, in other words, they would have had a lot of interest not only in courting royal favor to get up in the ranks, but also to be a bit Taoist with it. So, you have, during the early 900s, the Five Dynasties period, between the Tang and Song, a new incarnation of the zany Taoist sage beyond all borders and boundaries, was popularized. That was popularized in the Han, becomes a new hip thing, and it becomes a hip thing with generals who were lower in the Tang and then are vying with themselves and try out this new hip kind of interesting stuff that's countercultural, it seems. By the time of the Song, from 960 to 1279, a century after Linji's death, Linji's followers had collected and created texts that connected Bodhidharma and Huineng, popular with all five houses, to Mazu, Huangbo, and Linji himself. And that is as best as scholars say today that I have researched and read through, and I'm indebted to those scholars' work. The Song dynasty supported many Buddhist sects, including Southern-style Chan, Huineng. Some scholars have claimed that the Song was the first modern society. I have seen that in print. A new gentry class replaced the old aristocracy, the urban middle classes expanded, and printing, invented in the Tang and improved with movable type in the Song, spread literacy in Buddhist texts such as the traditional Mahayana sutras, and a new type of Chan text, the recorded sayings, Yulu, the koan collections. So as printing is coming into the world, there is a new kind of, just like Taoist texts are short and sweet and easily printable actually, and copyable, many of the shorter ones, you have a new kind of Chinese philosophical text taking off like a rocket. And it's short trickster encounters and sayings and as printing is coming about, that's a good time again for not only having a Gutenberg Bible somewhat later with a screw, in the press, but yeah, movable type and all of that. So these compilations of exchanges between masters and others that display enlightenment and individual freedom, known as koan in Chinese gong'an cases, court bench cases, dockets at the bench, I will refer to them often as koan, which is the Japanese name. The primary source was the Transmission of the Lamp, a primary koan collection, compiled in 1004 by Dao Yuan of the House of Faiyan, but it was actually published as a text in a competing house, but published by Yang Yi, a Linji supporter, and a major scholar in the Song royal court, as the Faiyan school was being absorbed into the House of Linji, into which it eventually went. So, after Mazu shouted and struck as wordless responses, Linji spoke of the silent transmission outside the scriptures. That is one of the things I did not understand until late in the game as I've been teaching these classes. Linji is apparently one of the first, if not the first, to actually start talking about this as a silent transmission. Now, what that means, if you've been following the talks, that when the Buddha holds up a lotus, I said at the time, that's lovely, that may not have happened. Why? Because the Buddha's talking about a silent transmission, and nobody really seems to talk about a silent transmission before Linji, and then his house has a bunch of stories connecting the Buddha himself to a new upshot Southern school, which doesn't seem exactly connected, and now all the stories leap up with Huineng's life and Bodhidharma, and now you have them connected to the Buddha himself and actually the official Chan lineage earlier. And so that's what the scholarship seems to show. So Linji was not regarded as the heir of Mazu's tradition before the Song, but his followers worked to establish him as the true man of the House of Chan. By 1029, the House of Linji had risen above the other four Chan houses, and all other sects of Buddhism in China, quite a feat, to become the favored spiritual and intellectual tradition of the Song imperial court at the time. The story of the Buddha silently holding up a flower was added with many others to the stories of the transmission of the lamp, which already had the song Imperial Seal of Approval, such that a complete record of Linji's silent transmission lineage was established as Zen canon with the Blue Cliff Record, which was written in 1125, 250 years after Linji's death. This was followed by the Gateless Gate in 1228, so Linji did not live to see either Blue Cliff Record or Gateless Gate, and official records of the life and teachings of, which we have already been drawing from, Huineng, Mazu, Linji, Zhaozhou, who will come next, and others. I will maintain thus, the reason I do not do Zhaozhou first is because it is possible, as some scholars say, Zhaozhou could be even a Taoist master, but he is definitely a trickster, kind of like in the Zhuangzi Taoist text. There's all these guys, hey, are these Taoists? So who are these? Well, they're all kind of together hanging out. In a very Taoist town, there was a master named Zhaozhou. He could have, whose name means Stone Bridge, and the Stone Bridge was of the town a Taoist place Taoist bums hung out under. What's up, buddy? I'm giving a talk. We're going to get to the cat again with Zhaozhou and all of that, yes. And so basically, Zhaozhou is possibly a Taoist, could very well be a Buddhist, very Taoist Buddhist, Chan Buddhist. But his life and legends seem like he was a kind of guy who got incorporated into Linji's whole house. So that is why I'm doing Linji first, his records, and then we are going to be doing Zhaozhou as what I consider sort of the pinnacle guy of this kind of genre. It's hard to tell what came first, chicken or egg here. Zhaozhou as this kind of comedian. I'm sure somebody existed who was that guy. But then as that kind of Taoistic trickster sort of stuff either inspired Linji and his house or others around them, they created the genres of texts and the story of Zen that is taken for granted and as sacred scripture and as the tradition today. So as I mentioned with the Buddha, I am not a Buddhist, either earlier Indian traditional Buddhism, Theravada, Mahayana, or otherwise, nor am I Chan nor Zen. So for me, I do humbly say, well, scholarship shows the story is quite complicated. And we are at a time when this sort of stuff, the books that I am inspired by to go through these lectures, have only been written in the 90s, 2000s, and onward. These are recent things that scholars are pulling together and finding new points about. So I happen to be happy I went to grad school and got some of this stuff. So Chinese philosophy, like Indian and Greek philosophy, is based in recorded interactions between the wise and the foolish, found in the core Confucian and Taoist texts long before Chan in China. Mythical tricksters, shamans, and sages have said puzzling things across human cultures to lead others to wisdom. But the koan records are some of the most puzzling words yet written, intentionally defying all expectations and understandings. While culture is always counter to other cultures, Chan, in the hands of the House of Linji, became a very unorthodox orthodoxy, a tradition of text that is opposed to textual traditions, an intellectual rejection of intellectualism. Versions of koan texts show that many of the stories were redacted in stages to cut exposition and explanations that detracted from the turning word or words of the unforeseen, simple, and brilliant response that displays the master's enlightenment, making the koan cases even less like the previous detailed philosophical explanations of the Buddha and Buddhist scholars, think of the long discourses, in the sutras and commentaries on them. And you can see this increasingly. In fact, in Korea, they have a tradition that even believes in stripping it even further down and just focusing on what is the sound of one hand clapping. You can see that there's versions of these stories that are longer, and then there are versions that are just 3 lines between the two people, but that's part of a longer dialogue. Now, is it better or worse with the more context? That's something these different traditions actually go back and forth with, as we'll see. Zen appears to radically reject all study of texts and devotional worship, but this is because Linji's house made koans central to Zen history and practice. This, even though as Zen folks actually do worship all sorts of gods and spirits, they have traditional beliefs, much like Buddhists, and gods here, bodhisattvas, it is, again, gods are comparable. But they do have many traditional beliefs, so people see Zen and they think, oh, so they just sit and do logic puzzles and that's it. Or mysticism and they have no other beliefs. Technically, there's all sorts of traditional beliefs Zen have, but Linji made it about koans and these sort of strange, puzzling encounters and then working through them as an individual, which then becomes a detailed, different variety of practices with different schools of Zen, practicing engaging the students in these koans and putting them in the roles of them in different ways. While the Tiantai and Huayan were more focused on texts and rituals, Chan focused on sitting meditation and koan contemplation. Without understanding the traditional sutras and rituals, which the Zen tradition still reveres, much of the context is lost, leaving the koans even more puzzling than intended, and they're made intentionally that way. Some say the koans have no solutions, or are designed to upset reasoning entirely. Others say there are solutions, but shifts in understanding and perspective cannot be entirely described in words, just as the act of pointing can't be put entirely in words, nor does it need to be. Many modern counterculturals, transcendentalists, Dada artists, surrealists, existentialists, beatniks, and hippies admired the absurdity and creativity found in the koan encounters. I was just thinking the other day, I have a short video on Sara, Tristan Tzara, the main Dada artist manifesto, and then he rolled him into the surrealist movement, Dada and surrealism, some of the modern art. He does say in his early Dada manifestos, in his lecture on Dadaism, he gave, I believe in 1921, I believe, he does say that Chuang-Tzu, the Taoist, he names in an older spelling, but also Zen. He says Zen and Chuang-Tzu are just as Dada as we are. And I happen to like all of that. I was quite happy to read those words. So, according to the legendary records, this is Linji's story and him ribbing his master. Linji studied with Huangbo for 3 years, but feared requesting a private meeting, as he did not know what question to ask the master. After the head monk encouraged him, Linji met and asked Huangbo 3 times, "What is the meaning of Bodhidharma coming from the West?" A very classic question, and as already mentioned, if this is a silent transmission, although Linji's kind of the guy who makes it a silent transmission, isn't he? Why would Bodhidharma have to come and tell anybody anything if everybody has everything and all is all and all is one? And each time he asked this question, Huangbo struck him and said nothing. He hits him with possibly ye old stick of compassion, the staff or the staff of the master or what have you. Linji told the head monk he was too stupid to understand Huangbo's wisdom. Perhaps he's a comedian, perhaps he is genuinely modest, I don't get this, and was leaving the monastery. He is not cut out to do this. Hearing this, Huangbo told Linji to visit Master Daiyu. When Linji arrived at Daiyu's place, Daiyu asked Linji, how does Huangbo, your master, teach Chan? And Linji told him about being struck 3 times. He just keeps hitting me. And Daiyu says, what a kindly old grandmother Huangbo is. He wears himself out trying to help you, and you still think of yourself and look for your own faults. And Linji had a great breakthrough of enlightenment. And he said, Huangbo's teaching, Linji suddenly exclaims, Huangbo's teaching is no big deal after all. It's easy. Daiyu picks up his staff and threatens to hit Linji with it like Huangbo, saying, you bedwetting devil, you little crybaby snot-nosed rugrat. You just finished saying you don't understand Huangbo, and now you say it's no big deal. Which is it? Speak! Speak! I will point out, I always point out parallels with Taoism, even though I may overplay them occasionally, which I don't try to do. You can find, so is there any difference or isn't there in the Zhuangzi, a favorite of Chan Buddhism? You are asked questions, and if you study Nagarjuna and Buddhist logic and other things, you don't have to say A or B. You can say both, neither, and you can freely play with both and neither in your behavior, your words. That's okay in Buddhism and relativism and skepticism in human philosophy. So he says, which is it? Like, are you just totally now this also is like, oh, gradual sudden enlightenment here. He's like, now you just got it, you whippersnapper. You were just saying you can't do it, you can't do it, you can't do it. Now you're like, oh my god, it's nothing at all. Now, which is it? Now, that actually, again, could be falsely trying to lead you into something. You say, which is it? Speak, speak, come on, come on. Not only do you have sort of like Mazu calling your name, being like, I don't know. He's like, speak, but it is very Taoist, like the Zhuangzi. It's like trying to bait you with a question into saying one or the other. So instead of saying one or the other, well, Linji grabbed the end of Dayu's staff and punched him in the ribs. Kind of gives him a playful thunk, jab in the ribs. Linji didn't answer Master Dayu's demanding question, but rather ribbed his superior playfully as if he was a familiar friend and equal. He actually treats him like he's a sibling or somebody he's roughhousing with. He doesn't hit him. Now, the Huangbo hit him with a master's staff. Linji roughhouses as if he's a sibling, as if he's sort of a total equal. That should be noted. Dayu pushed him away. And said, lay off me, man. Saying, you're Huangbo's student, not my problem. Not my monkeys, not my circus, as the Polish expression goes. As if Linji remains a failure. A lot of times in these things, it's almost never, and then he won, hooray. It's like, you're not my problem. Whatever. And you're definitely left with the impression that unless somebody looks specifically stupid, actually, even if the master says, you're just a fool, I don't know, that's not losing at all. And in fact, sometimes that's approval. It does seem that way in the text a lot. And if you pay attention, it definitely, and then the way the text rolls on, it doesn't seem like he's disapproving of him at all. It seems like he's like, oh, yeah, but he knows that there's no rank, as we'll talk about. So he's like, no, everything's on an equal scale. Oh, you're just no problem of mine. You just get out of here, you silly person. Recall in the Lietza, it's that they go, Lietza says, let's go over into Danan Guoza's house. And he's like, hey jerk, yeah. He's like, now that guy knows how to say nothing. Of course, he said words, but he wasn't saying what he was saying out loud. Literally. So, he says, you're not my problem, get out of here, go back. Now, he has gone to, what you see here is, as often in Zen, there's a pilgrimage going on. People are shown to go to multiple monasteries. That not only allows you to see these masters studying for more than one master, it also connects these different monasteries together as friends, that they're being mutually supportive, and that's showing the history of that and documenting it in the sacred literature. And revered copied texts here, this new kind. So, Linji returns to Huangbo, who said, you've come back so soon, which, of course, it's like, it's nothing to grow suddenly, it's nothing to grow gradually, it's all the same thing very much. And Linji says, because you've been so kind to me, Grandma, and told him what happened. By the way, you constantly find young timid bride, old Chan granny, which has very sexual connotations, and it's very much, these Zen masters are, I've mentioned before, to be a tiny bit bawdy here. They do refer to you as sort of a quaking virgin or an old granny, and that's actually kind of a bawdy sort of joke. So when he's like, oh, you're so kind to me, Grandma, there is a hint of that in there. It's like, oh, you're an old granny, you've been around the block. Yeah, you're the motherly old one who's, taking a punch or two. You know what's up. It's like, don't punch your grandma, please. It's, and hopefully, yes, grandmothers don't take punches, but you've taken a round or two with the Jaguars, And so, it's... Basically, he's like old granny over here, which has a sort of sexual body gendered kind of Taoist kind of kick to it for a bunch of bald, celibate Zen monks, Buddhist monks of any kind. So he tells him what happened and he relates the whole story. The next time I see that old rascal Dayu, I'll give him such a wallop, said Huangbo, acting like, oh, that other Zen master, he screwed up royal. Now notice I just told you, this text is establishing these two Zen masters clearly like each other. So, of course, that's not what the text tells you at all, is it? Notice, he's like, that guy, why I oughta... Now, this again looks like the Lietza Taoist text where it's like, let's go see the old jerk. He's like, that old jerk. It's like these guys are playing and screwing with each other, and they know that you know that it's like, I'm just gonna say, that guy, I hate him. And so, it definitely seems like that's the point here. It does not seem, at the conclusion of the text, like Huangbo actually doesn't like Dayu. So he says, I'll give Dayu such a wallop. Why wait, Linji said. I'll give you a taste right now. And he slaps Huangbo in the mouth, who laughs out loud and says, this fool has come here to pluck the tiger's whiskers. So Linji goes from fear to fearless and gets approval for striking two superiors. At first, Linji treats Huangbo as a superior sage and himself as a foolish failure, fearing and revering something outside himself. Much as Shang Xiu worried and fretted he would not receive the teaching as he wrote his verse on the wall before Hui Neng's 2 talks ago. Each time that Huangbo struck Linji, Linji saw it as a sign that he failed to understand. But Huangbo was trying to show him that it isn't about him, but rather how the mind we all share can make us tied up in ourselves. Even as Linji scolds himself, he is concerned with only himself, and not with the mind in general, either philosophically or as lived experience. When Daiyu said that Linji is being selfish, looking for his own faults, Linji realized that from the detached view of the single mind in common, everyone is quite similar and interchangeable, and Huangbo striking Daiyu is much the same thing as Linji striking Huangbo. If we all have the same mind, who kind of really cares who gets punished or kicked is part of it. The other, it also is here, along with that, and that it definitely seems, well, if everybody has the same mind, well, then everybody could get a kick in the ribs, and everybody's everybody afterwards, and it doesn't matter. And only if you don't really care can you really flow with it and see it. But that you also have here, and just to, well, it is very true that a lot of people, and this is good advice, there's something very profound going on here. Linji was not being a jerk to anybody at first. In fact, he was being very meager and mild. And then he flips around and he starts hitting people, and suddenly he's great. Which is weird, because of course you probably don't want to go around slapping people full on in the mouth and think that now you're a holy sage. So it's a really irreverent, weird story. But the interesting thing, the really interesting thing, is the lesson that he is taught that really opens his mind. As he's sitting there like, I'm so stupid I don't get it. And I have been having odd experiences in trying to talk about movies and other things with folks lately. And in beings, in giving talks and having people try to explain their work and try to explain to me why they haven't turned in their work or not. It is interesting, and I have been noting for a while, that a lot of times people feel like being a jerk is being an overt jerk. And there's a lot of ways, and I won't get all into psychology, and I've been looking too much into a bunch of psychology terms and other things. But there's a lot of ways where we could covertly or sort of against ourselves or in negative ways, instead of sort of positive, proactive or something, not positive, happy. There's a lot of ways where we can be down on ourselves and think we're being nice when in fact we're just being screwed up, and it's almost as if we're being jerks, but jerks to ourselves. We should be self-critical, but there is definitely the theme in Taoism and Zen that if you are fretting about how terrible you are doing something wrong. And that sounds dangerous because it does sound like we should say, but being self-critical is wonderful. It is very much, we're not going to do so much, well, I'm not going to do existentialism all right now, but there's a lot to existentialism and critiques of modernity that say, why are we, and I went off a little bit talk or two ago, why are we such cowards? And what it comes down to is sort of, a lot of times when people micromanage themselves and hate themselves, they think they're actually being good, but actually they're being just as screwed up as if they were running around slapping people in the face and being an outright jerk. Now, funny enough, he's going around slapping Zen masters who like that kind of thing or understand it in the face. He's not slapping random people. But it is kind of, as he's sitting there hating himself, it's almost as if he's the one hitting himself. And that is what Huangbo seems to be teaching him, is every time I hit you, what happens? It's very much like, I'm going to do something random to you. I happen to be doing the same negative thing to you over and over, which may confuse you. But I'm doing something negative, and how do you respond? If life slaps you in the face, what did I do wrong? That's your response. Why are you being so self-centered? It's really awesome because a lot of times people don't think being self-critical is being self-centered. I will also say, and there's been a lot of experiences, especially lately, where people will talk a lot and they're being self-critical. But in certain ways, by talking a lot and being self-critical, I do this all the time to people, you're actually being self-centered. You're taking the stage and performing kind of the martyr routine. This is very covert narcissism to overt narcissism. And it's sort of like, oh, if it's covert and I'm self-hating and self-deprecating in front of people, that's good. No, a lot of times it isn't. And it's almost as bad as being somebody who tries to pop people straight in the mouth. But It may be, again, well, let's not talk about which is more insidious in all cases at all. Let's just say that Linji was sitting there hating himself and doubting himself, and that's exactly like Shin Su. That will screw up your lineage and you getting the robe and the bowl. So later, Linji, I love this, was master of his own monastery, and he told his monks that when he was at Huangbo's place, he asked about Buddhism 3 times, and Huangbo was nice enough to hit him 3 times. Linji said it was like being brushed with a branch of fine herbs, like you're a breadstick at the Olive Garden, and thinking of it makes him wish he could be hit like that once more. He asked if anyone could give him such a beating, and when one monk stood and offered, Linji offered him his staff, then struck the monk with it as the monk reached out to take it from him. It's like, there you go, thwack. This is very Looney Tunes, all a bunch of kind of stuff. It's great Taoist humor style, and then with Zen it gets kind of amazing. And even when it is just hilarious, there's probably symbolic meanings and all kinds of layers to it. Much like Mazu, who called out to monks as they left the room, Linji enjoys interrupting people. He likes breaking frame, which would show you, of course, if you're in frame, then when you break frame, a lot of times you kind of forget what the context is and you're kind of broken out of it and staring at things in a whole new light or context or practice, of course. Like Mazu calling people's names out, etc. All right, so we have here, let's see. So we're going to stop this talk right now. And we're going to, and we're going to try to break this into some smaller chunks. So in the next talk here, we're going to talk about Linji's teaching of the true sage of no rank. Now, Shuangzi says, or at least it's in the Shuangzi, the Taoist text, what do I mean by the true man? And there's a lot of no-rank anarchism if you look at my talks about Taoism. Now, Linji says the true man, like Taoism, of no rank, which is anarchistic, like Taoism. So the true sage, the true man of no rank. I call it the true sage of no rank to try to make it gender neutral. I could not figure out, true person sort of doesn't roll. I'm actually trying to make it a single syllable, funny enough. I do try to do that on purpose. I try to err on the side of fewer syllables on purpose. I do. So the true sage of no rank, the true man of no rank, is a very Taoist concept, and this is going to be a central Linji teaching, and we're going to get to that here next, and that is going to roll right into when you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha. Why? And we'll just end up here on kind of the meaning of it. If you are too afraid to insult God, science, objective truth, whatever you believe in, you don't look at it as on your level, like Linji does after ribbing his master. You look at God or science or truth as if it's above you, and you're a failure. Well, that's the kind of thing that holds you back and screws you up. And maybe you need to get popped in the mouth, by Linji, except he's dead, so that's even better. Can't hurt much. So anyway, that's going to be the conclusion of this first talk. I think that Linji will probably break into about 3 talks, then Joshu for at least a talk, possibly 2, and then I want to get to at least a talk on the Blue Cliff Record and the Gateless Gate. I want to try to get through all that by the end of this week. I have given the students until Monday to do their papers. And while I'm sure they won't be watching the lectures up until the Monday, at least I can feel that I did some of these talks during the class period. So, thank you for bearing with me patiently. And so, next time we will continue to get into here. That was Linji's life. And next we will get into some of his central teaching. And as we go through here, then we will get into his sermons, which probably then, after the next talk on his central teachings, will be some of me quoting his sermons, which will really explain a lot of the context better than you will hear anybody says it, as he says it himself, behind koan mysterious, some would say mystical, some would say logical, I would say all of that, koan practice such as what is the sound of one hand clapping you in the face. So much happiness, and I will see you if I ever see you.